My name is Josh Miller. I'm a reporter with the Boston Globe, and we are so happy to welcome you here to the first of many live political happy hours. We want to welcome Governor Charlie Baker, 72nd Governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thanks so much for being here. If my calculations are right, you've been in office now 6 months, 1 week, and 5.5 hours. And I want to ask you a tough political question about your time there so far. What's been your drink of choice?
Water. What if you make one happy, you make 100 unhappy if you answer that question any other way.
You've become a consummate politician in your 6 months there.
By the way, I appreciate the math on how long I've been here. That's very helpful. But I think it's more like 5 hours and 40 minutes.
Okay. I'll adjust my calculations. This is called a political happy hour, and the last time there was an actual happy hour here in Massachusetts, I think you were in business school at Kellogg, and I wasn't yet born in 1984. I'm curious.
You have to put it like that? God! All right, how many people in the room remember happy hour? Yeah, all right. See? Look. That hurt. Ouch.
Do you think that the regulation banning happy hours in Massachusetts should go on in perpetuity? It was meant to curb drunk driving, or do you think it should go away?
I think I remember why it passed, and for those of you who don't, there were a series of horrific automobile accidents, literally one after another over a period of about 6 months. And well, as a general rule, I'm not a big regulation guy. I think that one in particular has accomplished its fundamental purpose, and I support it.
So it should continue in perpetuity?
Well, I'm not going to be governor in perpetuity, so, but I certainly think it should continue. My wife hopes not. I would say that I support the happy hour law, and I think it's a good thing.
Yeah. I want to go back and go away from 30
Anything else you want to ask me about in perpetuity?
No, not right now. Maybe a little later. There's been a big kerfuffle over something Donald Trump says, as there is almost every time he says anything. Marty Walsh says Donald Trump can't build a hotel in Boston until he apologizes for his remarks about Mexicans. I'm wondering, can he do business in the rest of the Commonwealth?
I guess I would start by saying that I hope whoever... Is this working? Okay, there we go. I would just say that I hope whoever gets nominated by the Republican Party is a uniter and not a divider. I think I've said plenty of things that I regret over the course of my life. I think the long story short on that is, for me anyway, most of the time would be it depends. I think there's a certain level of decorum that should be expected in public officials and also in sort of public people who lead big organizations. But that said, I'm not one of these people who thinks that, one mistake, one missed phrase and you're out. It would depend to some extent on the nature of what it was about, who it involved, and what the nature of the issue was.
You're a Republican. Does Donald Trump help your party?
Certainly generates a lot of news. I guess I would say that I've tried very hard to stay away from presidential politics, and that's going to be my goal, because no one voted for me to get into presidential politics. But I hope it's a robust, issues-driven debate, and I hope it gives everybody who's out there campaigning an opportunity to be heard.
I don't mean to belabor the point, but do you think Donald Trump helps the Republican Party and the brand nationally, of which I know you try not to be a part?
I think that someone will get nominated for president, and at that point in time, someone on the other side will get nominated for president, and off they will go. And let's face it, folks, in the end, this is like baseball, okay? If you think about the way the Red Sox season works, the hardcores are paying attention from the minute spring training starts up to about Labor Day, and the rest of the world kind of checks in afterwards based on how the team is doing and all the rest. My view on presidential campaigns is sort of the same. They're going to be up and down and up and down and about and this and that. And one week somebody's going to be interesting, and the next week it'll be somebody else. But in the end, each party's going to nominate one person, and those two people are going to have at it between the conventions, which are probably going to be around August, and Election Day, and that's when the vast majority of the population is going to check out what their platforms are, what they're talking about, and what they're all about. But as I said at the beginning, I hope whoever comes out of that on my side is viewed by the American public as a uniter and not as a divider.
Do you have personal feelings about Donald Trump that you're not sharing here tonight?
I thought I answered his question.
We're here in Boston. I mentioned Marty Walsh. During the forever snowstorm that we went through at the beginning of this year, you said you talked to him more than once a day or every day. Is that right?
At least just about every day, and sometimes more than once.
And now, what's your communication with him? Do you text with him? Do you call him every week, every day?
Well, if we go a couple days without talking to each other, I get kind of lonely, and so I pick up the phone and, Mr. Mayor, how are you? It's been a while. Did I say something? I would say we probably still talk at least once a week, because there's usually something going on to talk about. But I obviously, any governor in Massachusetts wants to see the mayor of Boston succeed. I want to see the mayor of Somerville succeed. I want to see local officials all over the Commonwealth succeed, because if they're succeeding, we're succeeding. And we've tried pretty hard as an administration to make clear to everybody that we care a lot about what goes on in local government. I'm a former local government guy. My lieutenant governor is a former select person. Our economic affairs chief is a former city manager in Chelsea. We have local government people all over our administration, and it's because we really believe that for the Commonwealth of Mass to be great, we need to have great communities, and we talk to a lot of folks in local government all the time.
You've said another thing you believe in is the ballot process here in Massachusetts, whereby citizens can move to change a law by popular vote. I want to just whip through some of the...
This is what you call using your own words against you. I don't know exactly where this is going to go, but we'll find out.
Where it's going first is to pot. There's an effort to legalize marijuana.
Is that right?
Effort to legalize marijuana for recreational use for adults in Massachusetts. There are two different groups pressing for that. You've said...
I'm going to vote no. How are you going to vote?
I don't have an opinion on that one way or another right now.
You sure?
I'm sure. I'm certain.
All right. Because it's important. We want to make sure that you'll be an objective journalist when you cover this issue.
Objective journalist. Is the no sort of an irrevocable forever no?
Yeah. In perpetuity. I've spent a lot of time talking to a lot of folks in healthcare, a lot of folks in the addiction community. I've talked to a lot of folks in education, and to a person, they say that the idea of legalizing marijuana completely, especially when it comes to young kids and young adults, is just a really bad idea, and I'm with them on that one.
Another ballot issue
That said, I'm a big believer in the ballot process, and if the people of Massachusetts vote to go that way, and I'm governor at the time that happens, we'll do what we can to, enforce whatever the law is.
So you wouldn't be in favor of doing what the legislature did to the diminution of the income tax in 2000? People voted to have it returned to 5%, and then the legislature stopped that and kept it from happening for quite a long time. If marijuana legalization happened, that wouldn't be something you would support, tweaking the law to keep it from happening?
I would only want to tweak the law if there was something that made it fundamentally unworkable. I mean, I remember when... now I'm going way back to not only before you were born, but probably before your mother was born. When Prop 2.5 passed back in 1980, there were a number of issues that were raised with, it passed 2-1, 3-2, but there were a bunch of questions that were raised about the ability for it to be implemented as written. And over the course of the next several years, there were several amendments enacted by the legislature, signed by the governor, and supported by the folks who had originally put it on the ballot to make it easier to implement. If there are issues associated with the ability to implement it, I think those are perfectly legitimate questions to raise and an appropriate conversation to have. But in that particular case, what it comes down to is whether or not the folks on the win side of the question are interested in engaging in a conversation about whatever one person's it won't work is another person's you don't support my initiative, right?
One other thing I've heard talk about is a ballot initiative to raise the cap on charter schools, essentially allow more charter schools in certain areas, which is something that hasn't had a lot of success in the legislature in recent years.
Passed the House twice.
It didn't make it to the governor's desk.
Correct.
Do you
Pass the House.
Do you support the idea of a question expanding the charter school cap on the ballot in 2016?
I know there are folks that are talking about doing it. I don't know if they're going to pursue it or not. I would obviously support a ballot question to raise the, well, I don't know what it says.
But
I mean,
the idea generally,
theoretically,
yeah,
I support the idea. I mean, I've made very clear that I support the idea of raising the cap for charter schools, especially in underperforming school districts, and conceptually would certainly support a ballot question to do that if, in fact, that's what it did.
And if it did that, could you see yourself spending some time campaigning for it, using some political capital to press for its passage?
Sure, but I would probably, I mean, the answer is yes. But again, there are a lot of other things I worry about day in and day out, and it would be pretty hard for me to imagine that it would become sort of like the only thing I would be spending my time on. I mean, MBTA, the opioid crisis, there's a lot of other things we're interested in besides that. It's very important to me. I would love to see the legislature do it without having to go to the ballot. That would be a much simpler and probably more effective and appropriate way to do it. But if that ended up on the ballot, yeah, I'd support it and would advocate for it.
Okay. Another potential ballot question is about the Olympics. I want to ask you about the Olympics. From everything I've heard, you've been relatively reserved in taking a position on the Olympics, saying that you don't want taxpayer money spent on the effort, but you'd like more information. Is that a fair summation? You've gotten a little bit more information with bid 2.0, this second iteration of the Olympic bid, and you'll get some more information in this report that's going to be delivered to you and the Speaker and the Senate President. I guess my question for you is, after
That's
that,
the report, by the way, that we asked for, not some other, right, okay.
you asked for a report, how do you describe it, an analysis of?
Brattle Group, which is doing the analysis. It's an analysis done jointly for the House, the Senate, and the administration. The way you framed that, it might have sounded like it was a Boston 2024 report. It's
Thank you.
actually a report that's being done by...
At your behest and at the
Right,
Speaker's behest and
right.
at the Senate President's behest. I guess my question is, after that, will Massachusetts residents know definitively where you stand on bringing the games, where you stand on bringing the 2024 games to Boston?
Well, I think it depends to some extent on the results of the analysis. I can tell you that the fundamental issue that the Brattle Group is reviewing is the thing that Stan Rosenberg, Senate President, and Bob DeLeo, the Speaker of the House, and I and many others in state government have talked about from the beginning on this, which is what are the expectations of Boston 2024 and the Olympics generally with regard to state spending. You know, what projects do they specifically want to see the state spend money on, and what are the estimates associated with how much they would cost, when do they have to be done by, and how do they fit into the $2 billion plus, $3 billion plus transportation annual spend on transportation relative to other things that we're interested in spending money on. And that will be sort of job number one with respect to this report. There will also be other components of this report that have to do with things like the Widett Circle development. For those of you who've been following this one in the Globe's written quite a bit about Widett Circle, and the Commonwealth owns about 60% of that property, and the biggest piece of the property is a bus terminal there that's very important to the MBTA, and it would need to move. And there's a price associated with moving it, and Brattle is helping us figure out what they think the price of moving that would be, which is something that Boston 2024 said they're willing to pay for, but there's been a discussion about how much they think it would cost, and we need to figure out if we think that's consistent with what we think it would cost. The other thing that's kicking around out there is all the air rights associated with that site, and that's just, again, the subject of a conversation about how much are those air rights worth and what's reasonable for the state to expect in return for leaving that site and basically giving up those air rights to a third-party developer. The other thing that will be part of this analysis is a pretty, I would describe it as sort of informed set of opinions and observations around all of the elements associated with this thing, with the understanding that it's important for us to know how close somebody like Brattle, who's done a lot of this kind of analysis before, is on the revenue piece associated with this, which is, you know, sort of the other piece we don't talk about that much, and the expense piece and the sort of cash flow associated with that, because one of the things we should all remember here is that the revenue comes in late, okay? The outlays are early with respect to how this works and what the, sort of what the cash flow scenario would look like and what that might mean for the Commonwealth. And those are kind of the three big things that we're expecting Brattle to report on. And, the definitive question you're asking is, until I see the report, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, they could come back and say, you know what, everything works, and, from our point of view, this is not going to be that big of a risk for the Commonwealth. Okay, that would be, that would present one point of view. They could come back with something that says, if you think about it the following different ways based on our analysis, there are big risks here, here, and here. Unless those can get mitigated, you guys are probably going to be on the hook for something. But that's kind of what we're waiting for.
Yeah. Speaking of the Olympics, do you work out?
I work out once in a while. I don't work out as much as I would like to.
Are you busy?
I'm busy.
I want to ask you about something that you were quoted as saying in a 1992 Globe article back when you worked in the Weld administration. You said, quote, "I hope that no matter what happens over the course of the next few years, people try to keep the conversations on what matters, which is the issues, and stay out of the bullshit." I'm wondering how that's worked out for you.
I'm not really sure what that question was about, although I get the fact that I swore in public, and a lot of people thought that was unusual. I was also, I think, 33 at the time, and that was one of many verbal faux pas I've made over the course of my 58 years. Has anybody in here never made a verbal faux pas? I'm just curious. If you mean, do I think we've done a pretty good job or not of staying with the issues? I would say yes. I mean, I think, but I'm an optimist by nature, and somebody, I believe that Massachusetts has a relatively robust political culture and public policy debate, and having served in state government as an administrative official, having run twice statewide for governor, and having served in local government, and having been involved in a million different activities of one type or another, of a variety of civic engagements, I think Massachusetts has a very robust political culture and public policy culture compared to what I've seen in lots of other places. I think, people talk about the fact that it's, a blood sport and all the rest. It's definitely not beanbag, but it shouldn't be, because the stakes in this stuff are important and they matter.
Turning back to booze, if you will, there's there are significant excise taxes on wine, on beer, on hard liquor. There's the income tax. There's the sales tax. There's a tax on various banking things. There are a lot of taxes in Massachusetts. Do you think businesses and residents here are overtaxed?
I think it depends a lot on how you do the math. There's certainly a lot of people in Massachusetts and a lot of businesses who think they're overtaxed.
Are you one of them?
I think it depends. But my general rule is that this is one element of how we should think about our competitive position. There are many others as well. It takes a very long time to do stuff here, no matter what it is. And anybody from any other state will tell you that it takes forever to get stuff done in Massachusetts. It gets done a lot more quickly and simply in other places. That is a tax, okay? It's a tax on time. Time is a tax. And don't kid yourself if you don't think that matters to small businesses, to cities and towns, to nonprofits, and to regular businesses as well. We have very high energy costs. We have very high healthcare costs. So I think our position on taxes matters, not just in absolute terms, but in relative terms as well. And if you think about property taxes, we're not that bad relative to most other people on property taxes, but a big part of that, we have very high property values, which has an impact on what people pay on an absolute basis, but our rate's not that high. Our income tax, which is hopefully on its way down to 5, which the voters asked for in 2000, would put it sort of in the middle of the pack. Our corporate tax is actually relatively high compared to many other states. Our sales tax in this region is about in the middle, but we are surrounded by some states who have no sales tax at all. I mean, this thing becomes a game where you kind of have to think about all of the elements of the cost of everything when you factor this in. But I certainly think in some cases we're competitive and in others we're not.
So overall, some people are overtaxed and some people are not. Is that what I'm hearing? Here in Massachusetts?
Are you leading somewhere with this, Josh?
I'm not. I'm wondering how you feel.
I'm not a big believer that we should be raising taxes to solve our problems. We've raised taxes almost every year for the past 8 years, and it's still left us with a $750 million deficit in the fiscal year that just ended and a $1.8 billion deficit in the fiscal year that started on July 1st. Our big problem is we need to be smarter and better about how we get stuff, and faster about how we get stuff done.
Speaking of taxes, there's a big back and forth of how to pay for an increase in the earned income tax credit for essentially poor working people. The House and Senate came to a conclusion on how they were going to pay for that. Are you going to sign that part of the budget into law and expand the earned income tax credit?
Well, since I proposed expanding the earned income tax credit by more than the House and the Senate ultimately agreed to, I would like to see that become law, and I certainly support making that law.
I mean, you have the ability to make it become law now. Correct?
Yes, we know.
And will it become law?
I think it's quite likely that it will become law, but I'm not going to say much about anything associated with the budget until we actually sign it on Friday.
But quite likely.
Quite likely,
Okay.
yeah.
I guess you made a no new taxes pledge in your 2010 run. You made a no new taxes pledge, didn't sign a pledge, but said it in your run last year. Whether you stick to that, is that something that residents and voters should judge you by?
I think any commitment or any pledge you make as a candidate is something. I mean, it's a statement of intent, and it's a point of distinction with respect to how you want voters to view you and that you want them to think about you. And I certainly think the tax pledge for me is an important part of why I believe a lot of people voted for me, and I intend to honor it.
We all make mistakes when we're new on the job. You mentioned yourself you've had some verbal gaffes over the course of your life. What are some of the things over the last 6 months, week, and however many hours that you regret?
Well, one of the things I've talked about several times is the fact that I didn't reach out earlier to the MBTA general manager, Bev Scott, when we got our third foot of snow in the space of 24, 48 hours there. I think that would certainly be one. I think the way there are a whole bunch of smaller things that are sort of not particularly meaningful that just kind of happen every day one way or another, where you'd like a do-over on certain things, but they don't turn into big things, which is important. But I think the outreach to Bev would certainly be a big one.
Is there anything else?
Well, yeah, sure, but you know.
Well, any big one? You said there were small ones. Are there any other big areas where you feel like you've missed the mark in the last half year?
I mean, so far, I think we've made a fair amount of pretty good decisions.
All right. A low regret governor so far.
I would just, so far I would say I'm a low regret governor. Don't put that on a bumper sticker.
Charlie Baker, 2018, low regret. What's been a big surprise over the last 6 months?
Well, I've had plenty of those, and in some respects, the job is all about not being surprised when you get surprised. In fact, a lot of people say, that one of the things about campaigning for this job is supposed to be kind of a statement about whether or not you could actually do it. And I always thought that was interesting. And one of the things I've concluded is one of the things this job requires is a fair amount of adaptability. And I think campaigns require a fair amount of adaptability. And I never, to be honest with you, until I actually got the job, I didn't really appreciate the sort of direct relationship between those two. But I'll give you a really simple example of how fast things change. We have our inauguration, noon on January 8th. We have our party at the convention center. I'm driving home. Phone rings. It's the mayor of Boston calling to say, we've just been selected to host the 2024 Olympics, and can you be back at the convention center at 7 in the morning? And my first thought was, I can't believe my first event as governor is going to be a press conference on Boston 2024. My second thought was, no one's going to care anymore about the fact that I got inaugurated. And That was exactly the way it showed up in the paper, you know? Boston gets selected for 2024. Some guy named Baker, oh yeah, he got inaugurated as governor. So I never got the big headline to show my parents, which is too bad. But that was sort of lesson number one. If you told me we were going to get 9 feet of snow between January 28th and February 28th, I certainly would have taken that bet. If you told me that the T was going to have the kinds of issues that it had, I would have taken that bet. I mean, there's just a lot of things in this job that happen that are kind of outside your control. And if you're not good at getting surprised, you better get good at getting surprised because it happens with a fair amount of frequency.
Beyond the things outside of your control, I'm curious on what your vision is for your 3.5 years left in office. On the campaign trail, you spoke about let's be great Massachusetts, great jobs, schools, communities, efficient, effective government, as thrifty as its people. Is there a bigger vision here for your time in office?
No, I think that pretty much got about right. That reminds me of pretty much most of what I said. I mean, a big part of what we've been doing since we took, well, first of all, I would argue that the way we chose to deal with the 2 budget deficits we inherited reflected many of the themes that you outlined in there. Cities and towns got the 75% increase of the growth in tax revenue that I said they would get. That was a promise kept during the campaign. We managed to put a modest increase in there for higher education as well. We didn't raise taxes. We didn't raise fees. We were pretty aggressive about putting some of what I would call the initial elements of a Main Street program for some of our gateway cities in place. Our capital budget, I think, reflects many of our interests and initiatives with regard to trying to spread some of the economic development outside of the greater Boston area. Jay Ash has been focusing heavily on downtown development and Main Street development as he's been working his way around the Commonwealth and doing his, what I would call sort of analysis with respect to where the opportunities are and what we should be pursuing. But I will say this, some of the things we were interested in doing early on got pushed off by the snow and the budget deficit and the T and some of this other stuff. I'm very interested in doing a lot more with what I would refer to as sort of occupationally driven education, which most people can translate into voc ed, career and technical, whatever you want to call it.
So more opportunity, more vocational, technical, educational opportunities for people?
There are a lot of jobs in that space, and there's a big opportunity there to provide real purpose and real direction and real possibilities for kids and for young adults. And there's a lot we can do there that we're not doing now.
So the vision is then what you talked about on the campaign trail, more effective, efficient government, moving the state forward on jobs and schools.
And communities. Look, if you believe you live in a community that has positive momentum and is heading in the right direction, and you believe when your kids get up and go to school every day, there's a point and a purpose to that, and it's working for them, and you don't worry necessarily about whether or not you're going to keep your job, that doesn't solve all our problems, but it solves a lot of them. The opioid thing was not something that I expected to become a big part of. There's another sort of surprise, although that one was more about what we heard when we were campaigning. But that cuts across all of those spaces. It cuts across community building. It cuts across economic opportunity. It cuts across a whole number of spaces, and it cuts across the Commonwealth too. And we'll be filing something on that on Friday that will be the start of what I hope is a big bipartisan initiative around dealing with the opioid crisis.
I want to ask you the vision question in a slightly different way, a journalistic way, if you will. I don't think I'm giving up any secrets to the journalists in the room that we put a big emphasis on the who clause. So for example, Deval L. Patrick, who rose from poverty on the south side of Chicago to corporate boardrooms and a top post in the Clinton administration, won the Democratic Party primary for governor tonight. The who clause, it sort of explains who the person is. And I'm curious, when you leave office in January 2019, or 4 years after that, or 4 years after that, someone's going to write a story at
Buckley will never let me answer this question.
At the Herald, at the Globe.
I can just see him over there.
Tim Buckley, communications
fine
director.
up until now. He is now in full-blown sweat. I am not going to lay down what my 4-year obituary is going to be.
Well, let me at least finish the question. Charles Dwayne Baker Jr., who handed over the reins of power today to Attorney General Maura Healey or whomever. I'm curious what the who clause is. Charles Dwayne Baker Jr., who made government more effective and efficient and left a legacy of...
Jobs, schools, communities. That's where it starts, all right? And that's
But
where
where does
our
it end?
primary focus is going to be.
Okay. That's the who clause. All right.
Look, I think this is really funny. You know, this is really interesting, right? The connector, all right? We led the nation in health care reform, bipartisan basis, Romney administration, Democratic legislature. We spent $1 billion breaking what was working here in the Commonwealth, okay? And we've been in the process of putting it back together again. That's one of the things we're going to fix, okay, over the course of the next several years. The registry. Anybody been there lately? Think it needs a lot of work? Me too. We're going to fix that too. There are a whole series of initiatives that are not very sexy and not very interesting, but to Joe Q. Public and to the citizens of Massachusetts, whether or not they work every day, matter. And that's going to be a big part of where we focus. When you're standing on somebody's porch in Dorchester and you're campaigning for governor and they have 3 kids in the schools and their number one concern is there's no good high school because they can't get their kids into Latin that they can attend, they don't really care about who this, that, and the other thing. They just want choices for their kids that are going to work. I don't really think focusing so much on making sure that we have strong communities, a strong economy, great schools, and a government that works. Sure, it may not be as sexy as what a lot of other people want to talk about, but at the end of the day, for most of the people who are out there, it really matters. And that is going to be what I focus on.
So that's the vision. It's the nuts and bolts.
The nuts and bolts.
The nuts and bolts. I want to ask you.
Buckley is in full-blown heart attack mode over there.
Tim Buckley, Communications Director for the Governor. I want to ask you, well, 2 things. One, you often speak about the things you inherited, the $1.8 billion structural budget deficit we inherited, but you rarely, I don't think I've ever heard you say from whom you inherited it.
What's the point? It's mine, right? Whatever it is, it's mine.
Can I ask you a sartorial question?
Oh, my God. Where are you going here?
This is from,
Oh, look at that.
this is from the Harvard. I went to Harvard this morning and took some pictures from the yearbook class of 1979, Harvard College 79 and 78.
I just have to say that I am so glad Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, not Instagram, Snapchat did not exist in the 1970s and 1980s.
First of all, what happened to that tie and that hairstyle?
I was a kid. That's kind of, look at the governor. I mean, look at his hair. That was the style in the late 1970s. We all look like that.
How often do you talk to him?
I don't think I have that tie anymore. I think that one's pretty much gone. By the way, it came down to about here.
How often have you spoken with him since you became governor?
A few times.
Regularly or
No,
on
just a
occasion?
few times.
Yeah. And I guess
He's actually been very helpful.
And do you ever talk about those things that you say we inherited with him?
No, I usually talk about other stuff.
Okay. What were you like in college? You look like you're having a good time in the photo anyway.
Well, I was an okay student. I had a lot of friends. I played basketball, and I didn't belong to any particular clique.
What was it? You were in math or
The thing I mean, the truth of the matter is, part of the reason why I wasn't as invested as other kids get in a lot of the goings-on around college was because I spent most of that 4 years as the big brother to a little brother who had a lot of issues and problems, and he actually spent a lot of time hanging out with me at school. And so a lot of the time that other people would have been spending doing what I would call collegiate things, I was spending with him. And he was 11, 12, 13. So I ended up having a slightly different kind of college experience than a lot of other people did.
Yeah. I'm curious, if I'm remembering right, your youngest daughter is going off to college this year?
Yeah.
You spoke at her high school graduation, right?
I did.
What did you say? What was the advice you gave to her and her classmates?
Point number one, make good choices. Please make good choices. I really think if you're a parent, the thing you worry about the most when your kids are young is that they will not make good choices at points in time in their life when the choices really start to matter. One of my major messages to these kids, and it's the same thing I said to her older brothers, is when you go off to college, you know, the trampoline is no longer there. The safety net of mom and dad. You are now, you know, a freestanding human being. You can't count on us to be there if you know, do dumb things. So please, don't. That was point number one. Point number two was, don't be afraid to try new things, but to remember point number one when you make those decisions. Because I do think, you know, this is a great opportunity for kids to experiment. And one of the things I like the most about the way her older brothers have handled their collegiate experience is they've both taken a lot of classes and a lot of courses that were not in areas that were just sort of obvious and natural. They took a bunch of classes that were sort of completely outside the norm of where you would have expected them to go. And I think they benefited from that. And the third thing I said was that I thought they should do whatever they could, no matter what, to try to stay positive about their circumstances and their situation. I had a really crummy experience in college outside of my experience with the Big Brother Association, and I got pretty negative about a lot of stuff during that period. And I think it's very easy for a kid away from home, in most cases for the first time, if you don't find a group to sort of run with and hang with, you can start to feel very isolated very fast. And I wanted to send this message to kids that, first of all, it's not that unusual to end up there, and that you should not be afraid to find the positivity in what you're doing, and if you can't, to be willing to say that and to sort of engage in a conversation with others about it. I think it's very hard to be 15 to 25. I think those are really tough years, and I think they're especially hard in the social media world that we live in these days. And, knock on wood, one of my kids is sort of out the other end of that, and Caroline's at the very beginning of it, and AJ is kind of right in the middle of it. And like any parent, I worry like hell about my kids, because it's just what we do. Anybody see Parenthood? There's a great scene in that movie where the dad, whose name I now can't remember, it's Steve Martin's dad, says, the one thing about being a parent is you never get to spike the ball, you never get to score the touchdown, the game never ends. You're just always in the game, praying and hoping that everything works out. And it's true. It just totally changes the way you think about everything.
I have two more questions for you before we open it up to the audience. One, I always like to ask in an interview, is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have?
Why do you think you have a 70% favorability rating? I'm kidding.
Nuts and bolts, low regret. Is that your answer?
Nuts and bolts. I do think people care about nuts and bolts. I will say this. I think we've tried pretty hard to build a bipartisan administration, and we've tried pretty hard to not chase political points and instead to just focus on the work. And I think there's so much polarity in politics these days that people appreciate that. I mean, when I'm just out there, out and about, talking to people, the one thing I hear over and over again from folks is, I just like the fact that you guys just seem to focus on the work, and you're not really looking to score a lot of points. Just good.
Final question for you. One more quote from a Globe article from 1998. There was an eruption in front of a group of State House reporters quizzing him about, you know where this is going, quizzing him about administration policy at a press conference. Reporters are such expletive idiots. Baker exploded. I'm wondering, have you evolved on that position? Or do you maintain your feelings?
There's a writer named Don O'Coin. Does he still write for the Globe?
Yeah.
Okay. Don was covering the State House back then, and he wrote a column. He said, Charlie Baker seems to have one scatological outburst every time he gets a new position in the administration. And he listed them out, and one of them, and you just happened to pick two of them. There was a third one.
I missed it.
Yeah, and I just thought that was sort of an interesting way of thinking about it. I would hope that if you secretly polled the media, and there's no other way to do this, I don't think, than to secretly poll them, I hope they would say that for the most part they think we in our administration has tried to be pretty open and available when they need us to talk on whatever issues they need us to talk on. I don't ever want to be one of those administrations where people say, you know, you can't get to the governor, you can't get, you know, I don't want to be that kind of administration. I think I wanted to be a reporter. I mean, that was my original goal when I couldn't be a pro football player. It was after that. And I used to write for the local paper, and I love the news. I love the media, and I hope we're always viewed as an administration that is open and available to you guys, because I think your role is unbelievably important, and I think it's especially important in this day and age.
Well, praise for journalists is always a good way to end a Q&A. Governor Charlie Baker, and then we're going to open it up to a few questions from the audience. This is from Isabella Jankowitz in Weston. Governor Baker, as a Democrat who thinks you're doing a great job so far, can you tell us if you will get behind a statewide strategy to build enough affordable housing to end homelessness in Massachusetts?
You know, this is a great question, and it's a hugely important issue. And the funny thing about it is, if you draw sort of a four-box, and I think about a lot of things as four boxes, you know, high, low, and you put per capita income growth here, and you put job growth here, okay? Greater Boston has tremendous per capita income growth and job growth over the course of the past 10 years. The rest of Massachusetts, not so much. And so what ends up happening is you have a big affordable housing issue and what I would call kind of the greater, it's like the downside of the success of the growth of the region here. But you have affordable housing in other parts of Massachusetts, but there's all kinds of stuff we need to do to develop our bona fides economically in other parts of the state. And so we've literally been spending a bunch of time creating an inventory of all the state-owned property. And I mean like a real inventory, which, you know, would be usable, sortable, and manageable, so that we could figure out where we have opportunities to put land that we already own to work around economic development in the parts of the state where we need economic development more than we need more affordable housing, and put land that we own in places where we need more affordable housing to work as sort of the platform for affordable housing development. And this is like the greatest single resource the state can bring to the economic development conversation and to the affordable housing conversation. And I think part of the reason we haven't done a good job as a Commonwealth in leveraging this tremendous potential asset we have is because we've never really figured out what we own and where it is and what it means and how it works and what it looks like and what roadways it's connected to and is it close to the T or bus routes and all the rest. And we're going to figure this out. I mean, this is like, believe it or not, folks, this is aspirational, okay? I mean, Commonwealth's been around for a long time. It's never figured this out. We are going to figure this out, and one of the things we're going to do is start to use a lot of that as leverage to create both economic opportunity outside that greater Boston play and housing, affordable housing, market rate affordable housing inside, because there are three things that drive the cost of housing: land prices, labor, and, by the way, permitting and the process associated with getting permits done. And if we can work, you know, one of the big elements of our community compact with cities and towns is around permitting. And if folks can work hard to speed up their permitting process, that would help a lot. We can help with the land piece. And if we can figure out a way to take two two of the three legs of this and do something to make it less expensive, I think we can build a bunch of affordable housing.
What's one of the metrics you talked about on the campaign trail on homelessness is reducing the number of families in hotels and
Yep.
motels to 0 by the end of your first term. Are there other metrics by which you and residents can judge how successful you've been in creating more affordable housing and reducing homelessness?
Well, I think one of the, let's face it, that's an easy, both of those are definable metrics, okay? Now, on the homeless families and the hotels and motels piece, we put a pretty big initiative into the budget early on, which I don't think we did a good job of explaining to the legislature, and as a result, we didn't really get it in this budget. We're going to go back at it and see if we can get a smaller version of it as part of the SUP, the final
The
year
supplemental
end
budget.
to close out fiscal 15. But that's something that is particularly important to me, and I believe important to us. The second piece, the only way to demonstrate success there is to put up units of affordable housing and do something that increases supply to the extent that it takes some of the run rate out of the growth in the median price of housing across the Commonwealth. And that's a pretty easy metric to measure.
Question from Twitter. Your view of progress on the opioid crisis. Still hard to get insurance coverage for treatment. This is the question. Need more attention to stigma and mental health.
So there's three pieces to that. Certainly on the stigma piece, I think whoever that is right, although I'm hoping that you now have a whole bunch of people in the public sphere who are talking about addiction as a chronic illness and as a public health problem is going to help with the stigma issue. We certainly are talking about it that way. The Attorney General is talking about it that way. A lot of the folks in law enforcement are starting to talk about it that way. People in healthcare are talking about it that way. I think we can change the nature of that conversation. I think the best way to measure success in this is going to be what happens with regard to overdoses and deaths. But there's a whole bunch of elements to this that are part of that 56-point series of recommendations we made in our plan that we got to implement. And I don't want to bore your audience by going through it from top to bottom. But there are a lot of things we could be doing on the front end here with regard to prevention and education that we're not doing. Basically, you can graduate from medical school and have almost no education in the course of your medical school experience in addiction and pain management. We think that's a problem. You can also get recertified as a doctor and a dentist and a PA and as an NP and as a nurse here in the Commonwealth of Mass by our boards of registration without ever having to take any kind of continuing medical education programming in addiction. We think that's a problem too. We're going to start requiring, as part of your recertification through those boards of registration, that you have CMEs associated with addiction and pain management, and we're going to start putting people who know something about addiction onto those boards and make them a larger voice in the conversation about what goes on there. We're also going to talk to the medical schools. We have some of the leading medical schools in the country. If we can get them to truly engage around making this a fundamental part of the way we train physicians and other clinicians, that will make a difference in how people do this more generally.
Is your point person on this the Secretary of Health and Human Services,
Yeah.
Mary Lou Sutters?
Mary Lou Sutters, who chaired the work group we put together, is absolutely our point person on it. The two other things I would say is, as part of this final SUP, we are also going to file the money piece associated with the recommendations that we made.
And what will that mean in practice?
It'll mean a lot of things. It's going to mean more beds. It's going to mean more money to support substance abuse programming. It's going to mean money for K through 12, for programs in schools to educate kids and parents. It's going to mean expanding the mandatory program we put coaches through now to make addiction and pain management part of the program that they go through.
And these will all be funded in this additional.
Right. But this is obviously one of those things where the goal here is to bend the trend and then eventually bend the curve completely. Right now, the trend looks like that.
Is there a time frame for that? Having talked to these experts, is this something that can be done over 5 years? Is it decades? Can we do it in 2 years?
Well, I would hope that we start bending the trend over the course of this administration for sure. If we're not bending the trend, then we need to rethink what we're doing and do other things. I absolutely believe this is when we can bend the trend on.
You said your point.
And remember, a bunch of the insurance reforms that were part of the 2012 legislation actually take effect in October of this year. Those will make a big difference as well.
You said your point person for this is Mary Lou Sutters. Who's your point person on the Olympics?
Probably Probably Steve Kadish, who's my chief of staff, although it's impossible to have a conversation about the Olympics and inside our administration without including Jay Ash and Stephanie Pollock and Kristen Lepori in it, which is Economic Affairs, Transportation, and Administration and Finance.
Great. Let's see, one other question from the audience. Are you going to upgrade the signaling systems on the T, and which will allow the T to run the trains faster? And
Yes.
increase-
Yes. 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 Yes.
Should this is just my personal question on the T. Should we expect if there's a winter not equally as bad, but a bad winter, that the T will be less terrible for commuters less of the time?
Setting the bar like right about here on that one. We have an $84 million resiliency plan. We spent a lot of time after last winter talking to people who run transit systems in snowy places and cold places, getting guidance and advice from them about how they prep for the winter and what they do to prevent the kind of meltdown that we had on our system. And we are implementing virtually every recommendation we got from those folks and should have most of them in place by Thanksgiving. So I think the long story short is winter is going to be winter, and what's going to happen is going to happen. But I think we are doing the sorts of things that should make for a much less difficult experience for transit riders this winter.
People's struggles on the T prompted a lot of drinking here in Massachusetts, so I thought I'd end with something drinking. What do you usually toast to? When you toast, what do you usually toast to?
Look, I'm a pretty simple guy, all right? I usually toast to the health and happiness of my family.
All right. Cheers. Governor Charlie Baker, 72nd Governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thank you so much for being here with us.